A silent parcel, a missing cog, a train that vanishes into fog while the truth lingers like smoke on the glass. Somewhere between the tick of a stolen second and the chime that never rang, a crime was carried out, not with violence, but with precision. What happens when time itself becomes the perfect accomplice? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was in the chill of a December evening, with a coal fire crackling low and the fog pressing against the panes of 221B Baker Street, that I first saw Holmes stir with that unmistakable stillness of purpose that presaged a case worth his talents. We had passed the better part of the afternoon in silence, he with his violin laid across his knees like a sleeping cat, and I with a medical journal I had no real interest in reading. Then came the tapping of booted feet on the stairs, followed by a knock, a telegram, and the first breath of Berlin frost into our London haven. Holmes took it in silence, read it twice, then held it to the fire without a word. "Watson," he murmured, with that particular brightness in his eye. "Do you recall the Prussian diplomat with the limp and the taste for Persian tobacco?" I did not, but I would, soon enough. Later that evening, I found Holmes with his long fingers steepled and the Times spread before him in its full crinkling authority. His gaze was fixed not upon the headlines, but upon a short column buried near the back. A minor note on diplomatic reshuffling in the German Foreign Office. "Curious," he murmured. "A man dismissed for illness of the nerves, yet promoted privately 6 days later by royal directive. A contradiction or a cover?" He tapped the page thoughtfully. "When men lie, Watson, they either do so too eagerly or not quite enough. The latter is far more dangerous." It was just before 8 when we heard the steady tread of boots upon the stairs, measured, military, and precise. Holmes rose as if summoned by a spell only he could hear. The door opened to reveal a man wrapped in a dark greatcoat, his moustache neat, his gloves damp with melted snow, and the faint scent of Havana tobacco lingering around him like an expensive secret. He removed his hat with courteous reluctance. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said in clipped, deliberate English. "And this must be Dr. Watson." Holmes nodded, but his gaze had already dropped to the man's boots, polished to the point of obsession and bearing the red dust of Saxon clay. The gentleman declined to sit, as if his presence might contaminate the room. "I come unofficially," he began, glancing at the drawn curtains. "I serve in Berlin as a translator with the British Embassy. My name is Weiss." Holmes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "3 nights ago," Weiss continued, "one of our junior attaches, Edward Lonsdale, was found collapsed beneath the Alexanderplatz clock tower. He had been struck, perhaps drugged, no one can say. The clock struck 8:47, or so we are told. But every witness claims something different. One says he saw Lonsdale fall before the bell. Another insists it rang twice. A third claims the clock had no hands at all." He paused. "Gentlemen, I need discretion and answers. Both are in short supply in Berlin." Holmes had remained silent throughout the tale, fingers laced, eyes closed. Not asleep, but inward. Now he spoke. "You said the bell struck once." Weiss nodded. Holmes opened his eyes. "That, Dr. Watson," he said softly, "is the most damning detail of all." He rose and began to pace. "In the matter of time, one chime means everything or nothing, and if a tower lies about the hour, then someone has taught it to lie." He turned, a gleam in his eye. "Mr. Weiss, do you have a return ticket to Berlin?" Weiss hesitated. "No, sir." Holmes smiled. "Good. Neither do we." "My name," the man said with a pause that seemed rehearsed, "is Herr Anton Weiss." He pronounced it with a faint flourish. the kind that suggests a man who either enjoys his alias or wears it like a borrowed coat. Holmes offered no greeting, but studied him as one might a specimen newly added to a glass slide. Translator for the British Embassy in Berlin, Weiss continued. I have been stationed there these past 3 years. And what is it you translate, Mr. Weiss? Holmes asked without looking up. Primarily German correspondence. Legal, diplomatic, and internal memoranda. Holmes's fingers twitched slightly. And nothing of interest, I presume. On the contrary, Weiss replied. Berlin is rarely dull. There was something in the man's bearing, too crisp, too polished, that put me in mind of those military men who had long since traded the battlefield for the chessboard of intelligence. His accent was impeccable, his collar too stiff for a man simply crossing London in December. Even I, dull as I can be in these matters, felt he was here under a far more urgent pretext than translation. It concerns one of our junior attaches, Weiss began, adjusting his gloves as though they had wronged him. A young man by the name of Edward Lonsdale. He had only recently arrived in Berlin and was still adjusting to the diplomatic atmosphere, if I may say so. Holmes inclined his head by the slightest of degrees. 3 nights ago, Weiss continued, Lonsdale was found unconscious at the foot of the Uranienplatz clock tower. He had sustained a blow to the head, though no weapon was found. Some say he was attacked. Others believe he may have been drugged. He remains under guard at St. Gertrude's infirmary, incoherent and unable to recall the incident. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Time of discovery? Precisely 8:47 p.m., according to the patrolman who raised the alarm. The clock struck just once, though no one agrees on what they saw or heard. One street vendor claims to have seen Lonsdale standing alone before the chime. A baker says he fell as it struck 2. A boy swears the clock had no hands at all. Fascinating, murmured Holmes. A man collapses beneath a tower that cannot agree with itself. Go on. Weiss hesitated, and in that hesitation, Holmes found his opportunity. There is more, he said, folding his arms. You've buried your lead, Mr. Weiss. Lonsdale, said the man, lowering his voice as though the wallpaper had ears, had access to certain correspondence not yet formalized. There were preliminary drafts, entirely unofficial, pertaining to possible troop relocations along the eastern border. You refer to Russia, said Holmes without blinking. I refer to that delicate constellation of names and promises which, if exposed prematurely, could do considerable harm. No such treaty exists in ink, but should such drafts fall into the wrong hands, then the collapse of a junior attaché becomes a diplomatic fracture, Holmes finished. Weiss nodded gravely. We had thought to contain the matter, but the contradictions, the chimes, the confusion, it all suggests orchestration, not accident. Watson's fingers tightened slightly on the arm of his chair. Holmes, however, remained as still as if carved from frost. Only his eyes betrayed the thrill of a puzzle assembling itself behind his brow. Holmes rose and crossed the room in 3 silent strides. He circled Weiss like a hound adjusting to the scent of a fox too clever to run in a straight line. Your boots, he said at last, bear traces of ferruginous soil, Saxon in origin, not from London. You arrived within the last 12 hours. Weiss blinked. The train? From Leipzig, Holmes continued, where you likely changed carriages. The laces are too clean for someone walking the Berlin platforms. You've wiped them recently, but not thoroughly. A detail. He stepped closer. Your watch chain is polished on one side only, likely from your thumb flicking it when anxious, as one does when transmitting memorized codes, not the habit of a mere linguist. And the ink on your left cuff, smudged, dark, was not from a desk, but from a carbon copy. You made one this morning. Something official, something duplicate. Weiss swallowed. You are no mere translator, Holmes said coolly. You are, or were, a courier, trained, I imagine, in both language and subterfuge. Tell me, Mr. Weiss, Did you bring your own cipher key, or were you instructed to memorize and burn? For a man so pale, Weiss reddened with remarkable speed. You are not incorrect, he said stiffly. I seldom am, Holmes replied, returning to his chair. Holmes leaned forward, fingertips pressed beneath his chin. 3 witnesses, 3 accounts, 1 event. And yet the clock tower strikes only once. Weiss said nothing. Holmes turned his gaze toward me. Imagine, Watson, that time itself faltered, just for a moment. What would we believe? What would we remember? I suppose, I ventured, we would believe what we expected to see, or fear we had missed. Precisely, Holmes said with a faint smile. A tower is an authority. If it tells you the hour, you obey it. If it strikes once, then once it must have been, whether true or not. He turned again to Weiss. You came here not because of an injured man, but because you suspect someone has learned to bend the hour itself, to make a minute vanish or reappear. Weiss looked at Holmes in silence and then, with a quiet nod, confirmed it. Holmes stood and reached for his coat. Then, Mr. Weiss, we must follow the clock. Let us see who wound it, and why. Within the hour, our bags were packed, and the fire in Baker Street had gone to ash. Holmes was already halfway through a telegram to an old contact in Königsberg when I asked, somewhat hesitantly, "Do you believe this man Weiss?" Holmes didn't look up. "No," he replied, "but I believe the contradiction." "And Berlin?" I asked. He looked at me then, eyes gleaming. "Berlin keeps better secrets than London, Watson. Let us go disturb a few." With that, we descended into the fog, toward the midnight train, and the most perplexing bell I would ever fail to hear. Berlin met us like a cold shoulder, indifferent, rigid, and wrapped in iron-grey fog. The city's streets clanged beneath our boots, and the wind carved its way through our coats with Prussian efficiency. Even the very ticking of clocks seemed sharper, more regimented, as though the hours themselves marched under military command. Holmes, for his part, showed neither discomfort nor distraction. Indeed, the foreign air seemed to invigorate him. "Berlin," he remarked as we crossed the iron rail of Alexanderplatz, "is a city where secrets wear uniforms and clocks keep 2 kinds of time, official and convenient." I was still adjusting to the guttural hum of the language, the sharp angles of the architecture, and the distant echo of boots on stone when we arrived at our temporary lodgings. Holmes had already written 3 letters and received one by the time I'd unpacked a single collar. He moved with quiet urgency, as though the city's harsh rhythm suited his mind. "We begin," he said, glancing out the window toward the distant tower, "by listening to what no one here seems able to agree on, the sound of a bell that may or may not have rung." Inspector Friedrich Baumgart was a man carved from oaken protocol, with a moustache like a cavalry sabre, and a voice that seemed to crackle with unresolved paperwork. He regarded us with the sort of restrained irritation typically reserved for foreign dignitaries who'd outstayed their welcome. "You understand, Herr Holmes," he began, "that this is a German matter." Holmes offered a courteous nod. "Naturally, I am merely here to observe the rhythm of time as interpreted by your clock tower." Baumgart blinked. "You mean the chimes?" "Among other things," Holmes said. "One must listen to the notes not played, Inspector." For all his stiffness, Baumgart was not a fool. He had the bearing of a man who'd buried more cases than he'd solved, and who understood too well the dangers of ambition wrapped in secrets. "You may accompany me," he said at last, "but not interfere." "Interference is a clumsy business," Holmes replied smoothly. "I prefer precision." Baumgart did not smile, but he gave a grunt that might have been approval. We were granted access to the case files, or what the inspector chose to call the case files, and so, with official reluctance, the game in Berlin was allowed to begin. Our first encounter was with a boy named Emil, who sold newspapers not far from the square. He was perhaps 12, with soot-darkened cheeks and a cap too large for his head. I saw the man fall, he said, stuffing his hands deep into threadbare pockets. He was walking near the base of the tower. Then he staggered and went down, like he was drunk or dizzy. And what time was this? I asked. He frowned. Just before the bell, except... He hesitated. There was no bell. Not really. Holmes leaned forward. Explain. I waited for it, sir. I always count it. Helps me know when to pack up. But this time, just silence. Not even a ding. I thought maybe it was broken. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. You are sure? Yes, sir. Would you say, Holmes asked gently, that time stopped? The boy laughed nervously. No, sir, just went quiet. We left him with a coin and a grateful nod. As we walked away, Holmes murmured, even silence can be orchestrated. When a bell chooses not to speak, it is either broken or commanded. Our next interview brought us to the narrow alley just off Friedrichstrasse, where a baker by the name of Otto Finkel was hauling crates of rye loaves and muttering to himself in a dialect so thick it might have required its own interpreter. Yes, I saw him, the man grumbled. The English one with the pale eyes. Bought a roll and paid with pfennigs like he'd never held coins before. Odd fellow. At what time did this occur? Holmes asked, inspecting a small scrap of newsprint Finkel had used as wrapping. Just before the bell struck 2, he said with certainty. I counted them myself. 2 chimes, clear and even. 2 chimes, Holmes echoed, but the official report says 1. Finkel shrugged. Maybe the police only have 1 ear. I found myself studying the crumpled newspaper. Holmes took it gently and noted the date, the previous day's edition. A man in a hurry, he murmured, never asks for fresh print. We took our leave, and as we stepped outside, Holmes whispered, 1 chime, none, and now 2. Either the tower is broken, or someone is playing music only a few are meant to hear. Near the open plaza, a figure stood tossing silver balls into the winter air, with admirable defiance of frostbite and gravity. He wore a patched waistcoat and a hat full of holes, and when Holmes offered him a coin, the man caught it mid-arc without so much as blinking. You saw the man fall? Holmes asked. Saw him drop like a sack of flour, the juggler replied. Tall fellow, sharp coat, bit of a limp. But it wasn't the fall that got me. It was the clock. What about it? It had no hands, the man said simply. Not frozen, not missing the time, just no hands at all. I laughed softly, but Holmes remained grave. That is a most singular observation. I'm not mad, the man snapped. I've watched that tower for years. Sometimes you notice when something isn't there. Quite, Holmes said. Absence, when deliberate, can be more eloquent than presence. We thanked the juggler and turned to go. Holmes whispered, 3 accounts, 3 impossibilities, yet all agree on one thing. The tower failed to tell time. And when time lies, Watson, men believe whatever they're told next. The Café Tintenfar sat beneath a sagging sign and behind windows permanently fogged with ink, pipe smoke, and whispered revolution. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with arguments and the occasional toast to the fall of empires, delivered with varying degrees of sincerity. Holmes and I took a table near the back, where an oily waiter handed us menus with disdain and coffee with even greater reluctance. He came here, Holmes said quietly, scanning the room, more than once, and not for the pastry. A girl of perhaps 20 approached with a tray and lingered longer than necessary. You're looking for the Englishman, she said in accented tones. We are, Holmes replied. She nodded toward a corner. He sat with a woman, always veiled, never spoke loudly, never laughed. Did she wear gloves? Holmes asked. Yes, the girl said, but she never touched her cup. Holmes tapped his fingers on the table. Lonsdale may have had more to lose than a diplomatic draft. A veiled woman and silence. always a duet of secrets. We left with more questions than answers. Holmes, however, looked almost pleased. "The ink is beginning to smear," he murmured. "Soon we'll read what was hidden beneath the lines." It was Holmes who noticed it as we walked the perimeter of the clock tower's base, a dark crescent no wider than a palm, set low against the stonework near the south-facing side. He knelt without a word, removed a magnifying lens from his coat, and examined it closely. "Charred sandstone," he murmured. "Recent, not from torchlight, nor natural weathering." I peered closer. "A lamp?" "Not with that arc," he replied. "Too low. This was set deliberately and quickly extinguished. Perhaps used as a signal or a marker." "And the police missed it entirely," I observed. Holmes rose, brushing his gloves clean. "Of course they did. They were listening to time, not watching for the ghost that lit it." We were returning through the square when Holmes paused suddenly, eyes fixed on a man speaking with Inspector Baumgart. "That," he said in a low voice, "is not one of Baumgart's men." I frowned. "How can you tell?" "His gloves," Holmes whispered. "Berlin issue, are grey wool with reinforced thumbs. Those are English cavalry surplus, ill-fitting, and on the wrong hands for the rank he pretends." As the man turned to go, Holmes added, "Someone is watching this case from within, but not from our side." His smile was thin. "The false must always wear something borrowed, Watson, even trust. If Berlin had a shadow theatre, not of puppets, but of secrets, then its leading lady was, by all whispered accounts, Frau Amalia Krueger. Her name had surfaced twice in 2 hours, unprompted, but repeated with a glance over the shoulder or a narrowing of the eyes. She played Ophelia, one man told Holmes at a bookstall, and perhaps more dangerously, she read Herzen and kissed a baron. "She's a flame dressed as a woman," muttered another. "Careful you don't breathe in the smoke." It was at Holmes's suggestion that we attended a rehearsal at the National Theatre that evening. The play itself I have forgotten, but I remember her, tall, veiled, and laughing without mirth as she dismissed the stagehand who mispronounced her name. Her beauty was of the sort that seemed carved from memory rather than flesh. "Note the way she uses silence," Holmes murmured, not unappreciatively. "A performer who controls her absence as well as her presence is always more dangerous." When she exited stage left, Holmes tapped my sleeve. If Lonsdale fell for anyone, it was not due to politics or poison, but a woman who knew how to turn sympathy into performance. "And you believe she is involved?" I asked. "I believe she is no stranger to roles, and may be playing one still." The next morning, I found Holmes already at the table, studying a small brass locket with the intensity of a gemologist. It had been procured, he would not say how, from the dressing room of Frau Krueger. "Not theft," he said, catching my look. "Rescue from a careless hiding place. It was behind a loose hairbrush drawer, hardly a challenge." I opened it with care. Within was a photograph, not of Lonsdale, as one might expect, but of a different man, older, clean-shaven, and unmistakably English. His features held a sharpness I associated with Parliament or scandal. "Do you recognise him?" Holmes asked. I did not. "Lord Bedminster," Holmes replied. "Vanished from public life 2 years ago. Rumoured involvement in an aborted treaty with the Russian Foreign Office. And now he sits in her locket?" I asked. Indeed, the heart keeps stranger records than any archive. It was then that I began to grasp the deeper structure of the case. Not merely a man felled by unknown assailants beneath a faulty bell, but a web of relationships stretching back years and across borders, all tied by invisible thread to the woman who wore red and laughed like a question. Holmes was, as ever, intolerant of mystery without machinery. He requested and swiftly obtained access to the city's maintenance records for the Uranienplatz clock tower, a feat that required no small amount of charm, 2 false credentials, and an unsettling grasp of municipal German. "You see," he said, spreading the records before us in our lodging. The tower is serviced every 6th Tuesday, without fail, but on the week in question, a supplemental entry appears. A malfunction? I asked. A correction, he said, pointing to a line scratched in red ink. Bell delay tested, mechanism silent for internal inspection, but no inspector's signature. That's a ghost entry, Watson, a phantom maintenance note. We took a short walk to the clock tower that evening, and Holmes, with a local map in one hand and the maintenance ledger in the other, counted steps from the spiral gears to a narrow alcove behind the bell housing. He ran his fingers along a support beam and withdrew them, dusty and oily. The gear shaft was adjusted, enough to delay or silence the bell, and then reset. No breakage, just obedience. Someone instructed the bell not to speak, I murmured. Holmes smiled, and the bell complied. Machines, unlike men, require only the right pressure in the right place. That night, Holmes dispatched 3 telegrams and received 2 in return, neither of which bore the name of the sender. The handwriting was clipped, the phrasing dry, and the content more damning than a courtroom confession. The man in the locket, Holmes said, scanning the lines, was last seen leaving a side entrance of the British Embassy in Vienna. No record since. But, he added, tapping the message, he was seen meeting a woman matching Krueger's description a fortnight before the collapse of negotiations in St. Petersburg. You think Lonsdale uncovered a link? I asked. I think, Holmes replied, he may have inherited someone else's secrets, or courted someone who carried them in a brass heart. He turned the second telegram over. A theatre patronage list. Krueger's company received a private grant from a banking interest connected to the same lord. Coincidence, Watson, is a poor liar. I watched as Holmes folded both notes into his breast pocket. His expression was unreadable, but his movements had a clarity I knew well. When hearts and treaties share the same architect, he said, the stage is never far from the gallows. Later that afternoon, Holmes stood by the window with his hands behind his back, the fingers tapping rhythmically against one another, like a man conducting a silent orchestra. There is a salon, he said, of some literary ambition and considerably less literary clientele. It meets under the auspices of Herr Linz and his wife, a woman with a fondness for utopian essays and absinthe. And you propose we attend? I asked, already uneasy. Indeed, tonight, and with some discretion. These are not gatherings one stumbles into, at least not without tripping a wire or two. And what role shall I play? I inquired warily. You, Watson, shall be yourself. An English doctor, nervous, respectable, moderately educated in Latin, and prone to misusing it. And you? Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. I shall be Professor Seamus Doyle of Trinity College, a philosopher with anarchist sympathies and a taste for Baudelaire. I expect to be utterly charming. I gave him a look of long-suffering disbelief. He merely added, Oh, and Watson, try not to be too honest. Honesty is the one vice they're certain to distrust. By 10 o'clock that night, I found myself seated on a cracked velvet divan, sipping bitter wine and listening to a young man with a beard like a broom deliver a sonnet about machines and motherhood. Holmes, or rather Professor Doyle, was in his element, his brogue thick enough to spread on bread, and his hands flying in philosophical flourish. Time, my dear children, he was saying, is not a wheel, but a weapon, and the state uses it to strike you every morning at 8. They applauded, the radicals and poets and pale young women with ink on their cuffs. Holmes bowed theatrically and lit a pipe with a flourish, glancing at me only once, a flick of the eye, meaning watch now. I attempted to converse with a small group in the corner, quoting Horace badly and receiving pitying nods. I was not, I fear, an impressive conspirator. Still, I observed carefully. Holmes drifted from circle to circle, dropping quips, teasing allegiances, and pretending to forget names. At one point, he delivered a scathing critique of the Prussian railway timetable and received spontaneous applause. Later, as we stood beside a shelf of pamphlets no one read, Holmes leaned toward me and murmured, "They've built a system of ciphers disguised as critique. Let's see who blinks first." It was near midnight when Holmes caught sight of it. A handshake, brief and unremarkable, except for the sequence. One grip, 2 fingers pressed to the pulse, then a twitch of the thumb. It passed between a tall man with a painter's satchel and a woman in a navy cloak. He whispered, "That is not a greeting. It is a confirmation." I followed his gaze. "Of what?" "Exchange," he replied. "But not of ideas, something physical, something past, likely earlier today, and this gesture seals the account." As we left, Holmes offered the same gesture to a man near the door. The man blinked, startled, and stiffened. Holmes nodded to him with false warmth. "I've always admired efficiency," he said. Outside in the crisp Berlin air, Holmes turned to me with that glint I'd come to associate with the scent of blood in his mind. "The salon is not a breeding ground for revolution, Watson. It's a ledger, where truths are traded like coin. Lonsdale was not betrayed by an idea, but by a schedule." We returned once more to the clock tower, this time under the cover of fog and late hours. Holmes moved with the certainty of a man unburdened by doubt. "Lonsdale was meant to be seen," he began, "collapsed beneath the clock at an hour no one could quite agree on, by witnesses whose recollections had been corrupted in advance." "Why?" I asked. "Because confusion," he said, "was the point." He led me to the alcove we had visited days before, then lifted a thin panel near the base of the internal gear housing. Behind it was a hollow space no larger than a shoebox. "It was here," Holmes said, "that the exchange occurred, not at the embassy, not by courier, but at the one place every eye avoids because it is assumed to be sacred, a city's timekeeper." He stood. Krueger was the distraction, Lonsdale the bait, Weiss, our so-called client, was likely the cleaner, ensuring the real document vanished in the noise of diplomacy and drama. "And the bell?" I asked. Holmes gave a soft chuckle. "A perfect accomplice. It struck once, or not at all, exactly as needed, because when time behaves oddly, people mistrust their own memory, and no jury convicts on doubt alone." It was on the following morning that Holmes informed me, without ceremony or apology, that I would be impersonating a diplomatic courier. "Me?" I exclaimed, nearly dropping my tea. "You are English, military, and possess just the right amount of discomfort in a foreign tongue," Holmes replied, already folding a square of parchment into a sealed packet. "You will be believed precisely because you are unsuited to the role. And what, pray, shall I be carrying?" "A decoy, falsified treaty excerpts with just enough real names to tempt anyone with treason in their blood." I stared at the innocuous leather satchel he placed before me. "And how am I to behave?" "Like a man with something to lose and no talent for subterfuge. In other words, like yourself under pressure." "I do hope this is not a death sentence dressed in a diplomatic pouch." Holmes' eyes twinkled. "I very much doubt it. No one dares assassinate a courier at a clock tower. Not when time has already killed one man this week." He clasped the flap shut with a neat flick and handed it to me. "Midnight, Watson, beneath the chimes. If someone follows, let them. If someone stops you, stall. The bell will cover the rest." By dusk, the false courier had become the newest whisper in Berlin's conspiratorial undercurrent. Word of an Englishman bearing crucial papers passed from lip to lip, mostly inaccurately, but with enough scent of truth to rouse attention. Holmes, of course, fanned the embers subtly. He revisited the salon in the guise of a less philosophical version of Professor Doyle, dropping hints like breadcrumbs behind a fox. A remark about embassy reshufflings here, a muttered warning about troop movements there, all just enough to suggest knowledge without control. I, meanwhile, performed my role with reluctant sincerity. I paced. I stammered when asked questions in German, and I clutched the satchel with all the theatricality of a man who might accidentally leave it behind at a bakery. Holmes watched everything. It was he who noticed the sudden politeness of a man who had previously ignored us, and the brief shadow that lingered a beat too long behind the cafe door. "They've noticed you, Watson," he murmured that evening. "And more importantly, they've decided you're clumsy enough to be exploitable." "And what of Weiss?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "Weiss is silent. That makes him either blind or hunting in silence. I suspect the latter." "There is," Holmes said with delight, "an obscure mechanical ritual performed at the Uranienplatz Tower every fourth Saturday of the month. A recalibration sequence that causes it to chime 4 times at midnight." "A clock that strikes 4 times at 12, I repeated, blinking. "An engineering anomaly, usually masked by crowd noise, but tonight will be blessedly quiet." He was already examining a pocket watch. 4 chimes, 4 seconds, just enough to drown a conversation or conceal a theft. "And just long enough for me to be attacked," I offered dryly. He didn't look up. "I shall be very nearby." That night, we took our positions. I approached the base of the tower, satchel over my shoulder, nerves very much in attendance. Holmes vanished into the ink of the city, leaving me with only the faint assurance that he was watching. The first chime came unexpectedly loud, a slow, echoing clang that rang like judgment. Then the second. Footsteps. The third. A hand on my shoulder. The fourth. But it wasn't what I expected. No blade, no voice, just silence and breath, and the unmistakable sense of someone waiting for me to move. Then came a whisper. "Walk, slowly, toward the stairs." It was not the stairs I climbed first, but the pulse of fear. Each step echoed in my bones, as the shadow behind me, male, I sensed and composed, urged me upward with an unspoken urgency. And then, before the full confrontation could unfold, a voice broke the silence from above. "Stop!" A woman's voice, calm, familiar. We turned in unison, and there at the top of the staircase, framed by the old brass bell, stood Frau Krueger, not veiled now, but bold and bare-faced, the wind twisting strands of hair around her cheek, like half-written verses. She looked neither desperate nor heroic, merely certain. "You are being used," she said to me. So was I. Holmes emerged from behind the bell housing like a character timed precisely for a third-act revelation. "Then you've decided to change the script, madame." Krueger didn't flinch. "I never wrote it." Holmes approached her slowly. "Why warn us now?" "Because I thought I was clever," she said. "But I was only cast for my resemblance, not my mind. I was told I'd distract, not damage. Then Lonsdale collapsed, and I understood." Holmes nodded. "And Weiss." Her eyes darkened. "He was never my handler. He was everyone's, including yours." Watson gasped. "I did, I admit." But Holmes remained composed. "I suspected as much. Still, hearing it confirmed does take the shine off my smugness." Krueger stepped aside. "He's already in the tower, you know." Holmes looked down the stairs. "Then let's not keep our diplomat waiting." I advanced, still gripping the satchel as instructed, and ascended the remaining steps into the shadowed crown of the tower. The old brass bell loomed above me, silent now, a relic of order in a city of whispers. And there, precisely as if awaiting a cue from some malevolent director, stood Herr Weiss, except he was not Herr Weiss. Gone was the courteous stoop, the affected Viennese drawl. He stood upright, taller than I remembered, and the limp with which he had charmed bureaucrats had vanished like fog under a noon sun. His voice, when he spoke, was clipped, harsh, unmistakably Prussian. "Dr. Watson," he said without surprise, "or shall I call you Courier?" He stepped closer, gloved hands at his back like a man reciting an execution order. "Curious, isn't it?" he continued. "How one can hide in plain sight, provided one wears the proper accent and the right limp. People never question the weak. I believe Holmes might disagree, I replied, stalling. He gave a tight smile. Yes, Holmes, always 3 steps behind. But clever enough to send you up with false documents. That at least I respect. My heart pounded like the tower's missing chimes. You won't leave with them, he said calmly. You will hand me that satchel. Now. His eyes glinted, not with rage, but precision. And that was when I heard it, the faint scrape of leather against iron just behind the bell. Holmes had arrived. Holmes emerged from the tower's inner shadow like the very spirit of judgment, silent and sudden. Weiss turned, startled but too well trained to flinch. You overestimated your anonymity, Weiss, Holmes said coolly, and underestimated the acoustics of this bell tower. It's remarkably difficult to whisper treason here without being heard. Weiss narrowed his eyes. You've brought soldiers? I brought ears, Holmes replied. Then, addressing the darkness above the stairs, he called clearly, Inspector Baumgart, if you please. From the spiral below, heavy boots rang against the iron treads. Within seconds, 3 uniformed men filled the landing, revolvers drawn, but held low with Germanic restraint. The inspector, grey-moustached and rigid as an oaken plank, nodded once toward Holmes. The man is armed? He asked. Weiss didn't deny it. His hand had already moved toward his coat. Gently, Holmes warned, tone flat as slate. You're good, Weiss, but not fast enough to draw, shoot, and leap before Baumgart's men prove their marksmanship. Weiss's hand hovered, then withdrew, empty. Very wise, Holmes murmured. And yet, there remained something unreadable in the traitor's stance. He had not collapsed into despair or even frustration. He was studying us, calculating. Holmes seemed to notice it too. Watson, he said suddenly, move back, behind me. Why? I asked. But it was too late for answers. Weiss's hand darted again. It happened with such suddenness that I scarcely recall the details. Only the sensation. A flurry of movement, a shout from Baumgart, the crack of a shot that seemed to ring from the walls, like the echo of war. Weiss had not aimed to kill. His revolver, as it turned out, was never loaded. Instead, his hand had hurled a small bundle from beneath his coat. Wrapped in linen, bound with wires and sealed tags. It struck the steps behind us, bounced once, then tumbled downward in a clatter that seemed louder than the shot itself. Holmes did not chase it. He advanced on Weiss in a single bound, wrested the pistol from his hand with a clean twist, and stepped back, breathing steadily. Baumgart's men surrounded the defector before he could flee, though I suspect he never truly intended to escape. Holmes turned to the inspector. The bundle, false, meant to distract, not deliver. Send someone for it, but don't waste your best boots. Weiss, subdued but still composed, stared at Holmes. You knew I would come, he said. Holmes nodded. I knew you would stage one last move, but it came 3 seconds too late. Frau Krueger awaited us below, her face taut with uncertainty. When she saw Weiss in custody, flanked by Baumgart's men, her lips parted in something between relief and dread. Holmes halted before her. A fascinating performance, madame. I told you the truth, she said quickly. I didn't know who he was. Not truly. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Oh, I believe you. She blinked, surprised. But I also believe, Holmes continued smoothly, that you knew there was someone above you, and I believe you suspected it was Weiss far earlier than you admitted. She frowned. Why didn't you stop me? Because I needed Weiss to act, and I needed to know if you would warn us before he did. Krueger's voice shook now. So I was part of the test? No, Holmes replied gently. You were the test. Her hands clenched at her sides. And what now? Holmes turned to Baumgart. She remains under protection until the ministry decides. She's more valuable as a witness than a prisoner. I could not help but glance at her as we departed. She was not crying, nor did she thank Holmes. Her role had shifted so many times, I suspect even she no longer knew the full truth of where she stood. Back at the hotel, I asked Holmes quietly, "Do you think she ever truly changed sides?" He lit a match, his eyes distant. "People rarely change sides, Watson. They simply run out of reasons to pretend." The events of the preceding 48 hours had left me in a curious state of mental agitation. Though the crisis had passed and Weiss was safely in custody, my mind remained tangled in the intricate web Holmes had so deftly navigated. It was only after we returned to our modest Berlin lodgings, a fire crackling low in the grate, that I found myself able to exhale. Holmes, as was his wont after the resolution of a case, had returned to his most languid form, limbs draped across a chair as though their exertions had belonged to another man. He regarded the hearth with a look that was almost fond. "Well, Watson," he said, producing a slender pipe from within his dressing gown, "you have earned your promotion to the diplomatic corps." "I would be grateful if the role required less climbing," I muttered, rubbing a bruise on my thigh. He chuckled, the rare sound of satisfaction in his otherwise austere register. "And yet you played your part beautifully. The satchel, the uniform, the anxious glances, all convincing enough to flush the spider from his nest." I leaned forward. "But there are pieces still missing, Holmes. Weiss, the bell, Krueger. How did you arrive at them?" Holmes smiled faintly and tapped the ash from his pipe. "Ah, Watson, then let us begin with the boots. I have often remarked," Holmes began, "that the human tendency is to overlook what lies underfoot, sometimes quite literally." I nodded, uncertain where this preamble led. "When I first met Weiss, you may recall, I bent to retrieve his dropped cane. In doing so, I noted a peculiar sheen upon the edges of his boots, faint but unmistakable." "Oil?" I offered. "Precisely, but not the sort one encounters in motor rooms or kitchens. This was an industrial lubricant, of the kind used in clock mechanisms and bell towers, a rare formulation involving graphite and clove." I frowned. "But surely others might have stepped in it." Holmes shook his head. "Not without cause. Access to the tower's mechanism is restricted. One must climb a locked stair, dislodge a maintenance hatch, and duck beneath a large cogwheel to even approach the oil." He took a long draw from his pipe. "Now, consider. Weiss's supposed limp, which disappeared only after we confronted him, would have made such contortions difficult. Yet he bore the oil. He had, therefore, made that climb. Recently." I sat back, the implications dawning. "He wasn't just part of the salon then," I said slowly. "He was tampering with the tower itself." Holmes inclined his head. "Not merely tampering, my dear Watson, rehearsing." Holmes rose and moved to the hearth, where he retrieved a folded scrap of burgundy cloth from the mantel. "You recognize this?" he asked. I examined it. The fabric was thick, of fine weave, and oddly dense to the touch. "A theatre curtain?" I guessed. "From Krueger's own venue," Holmes confirmed. "It went missing from her storehouse 3 weeks prior, an incident she blamed on moths and careless stagehands. In truth, it was repurposed." "For what?" Holmes returned to his chair. "To silence the bell." I blinked. "But the bell was struck that night." "It was," he agreed, "but only faintly, muffled by the curtain wrapped around its interior. The velvet absorbed the impact, rendering the chimes indistinct. The police, familiar with mechanical faults, suspected a defect. And Weiss used that moment to move undetected. Just so, he calculated that a 4-stroke chime would draw attention, but if the bell were muted, then footfalls, whispering, even a brief struggle might pass unnoticed." I let out a low whistle. "Ingenious." Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "Theatre people often possess an admirable grasp of acoustics." I could not help but marvel at the economy of the plan. A stage curtain turned silencer, an oil trace turned confession. "But it wasn't the bell that betrayed him," I murmured. "It was the boots." Holmes raised his brows. "We rarely fall because we look too far, Watson. Most men trip on what is nearest. And Lonsdale? I asked. The attack seemed real enough. Real in spectacle, but not in substance, Holmes replied. Observe, no bruises, no blood, and no true violence. Yet our poor diplomat collapsed in the square with theatrical timing. You think it was feigned? No, not feigned. Engineered. Holmes reached for a small vial on the side table and held it to the light. Chloral hydrate, administered subtly, almost certainly in a drink earlier that evening. Delayed in onset, but abrupt once it strikes. I've used it myself in more ethical contexts. But why would Weiss drug him? To create the illusion of an ambush, Holmes said. Had Lonsdale merely disappeared, suspicions would have turned inward. But a dramatic collapse, a public incident, suggests outside interference, and thereby distracts from the real objective, I said, following the thread. The transfer of false cables under cover of chaos. Holmes gave a short nod. Exactly. The whole affair was staged not to harm Lonsdale, but to draw attention and sympathy, while Weiss completed his substitution in the tower above. I exhaled, the scale of it now fully apparent. One wonders, I said, how many performances Weiss had prepared. Holmes studied the fire, the glow dancing on his angular features. Enough, he said softly, to make even the honest man doubt the stage from which he speaks. Holmes rose again and began to pace, slowly, as though in rhythm with the very mechanism he was about to describe. You see, Watson, the brilliance of Weiss's operation did not lie merely in misdirection or in disguise. Those are theatrical tricks. No, what truly marked him as a dangerous mind was his manipulation of something we all believe to be incorruptible, time itself. Time, I echoed. The tower clock, Holmes said. It was halted, not fully, but for precisely 6 minutes and 14 seconds by introducing friction into the escapement, a sliver of resin easily dissolved later by the morning sun or a slight application of steam. He turned, his eyes gleaming. Those lost minutes gave him what no sleight of hand could, plausible discrepancy. When the courier, yourself in this case, arrived with the decoy, the hands of the clock read one thing to the observers below, and another to those waiting in the salon. The confusion was enough to cloud the record, making your arrival and Weiss's substitution nearly simultaneous in the public eye. I sat back, struck dumb by the simplicity of it, and when the clock resumed, Holmes continued, all proceeded as though nothing had transpired, except, of course, that the real dispatch was no longer where it ought to be. He paused. Sometimes, Watson, it is not the accomplice with a gun who is most dangerous. It is the one with a watch. I must confess to a moment of affront. And when, may I ask, were you intending to tell me about the frozen clock or the resin? Holmes smiled with infuriating calm. After the mechanism had served its purpose. So I was to be the unwitting bait in a perfectly timed illusion. Unwitting, yes, he replied, but hardly unskilled. You walked into the snare with precisely the right gait of nervous tension. A professional would have hesitated at the wrong instant or betrayed knowledge of the risk. I harumphed, but could not deny the point. Holmes resumed his seat, folding his long fingers before him. There is an art, Watson, to removing unnecessary variables. You, for instance, are reliable, brave, and, on occasion, delightfully unaware. I am flattered, I said dryly. The more you knew, the more you might have inadvertently signalled. Weiss was an observer before all else, a man who studied expressions as much as movements. Any deviation in your confidence, any awareness of the clock's sabotage, might have led him to abort the plan. He regarded me with that odd flicker of warmth he reserved for moments of quiet admiration. It is sometimes the most honest actor who delivers the greatest performance. I muttered something unprintable and reached for the brandy. And Krueger? I asked. You said she was more than she seemed. Holmes nodded, his tone turning contemplative. Frau Krueger is no villain, Watson. At worst, she is a woman caught in a net she once thought herself clever enough to untie. She came to warn us, I said. Yes, but only after the strands had begun to fray beneath her fingers. She was useful to Weiss, a provider of props, of silence, and of entrances and exits timed to the second. She was the one who supplied the velvet. Indeed, she believed it was for a harmless distraction, perhaps even part of a political prank. But once the deception widened, once she saw what Weiss truly intended, guilt became intolerable. I remembered her drawn face and trembling hands, and so she turned. Holmes was silent for a moment, then spoke more softly than usual. There is a peculiar cruelty in employing the tools of the theatre for treachery. The stage relies upon illusion, yes, but also on trust, between performer and audience, illusion and belief. Weiss used her gift to construct a fiction and then punished her for forgetting the script. He sighed, the sound scarcely audible. Let us hope the guilt that follows her does not echo louder than applause ever did. The embers had faded to a quiet glow when Holmes stirred once more. There is a class of crime, he said, which does not rely on blood or brute force. Rather, it succeeds through rhythm, through the quiet sabotage of order. I looked at him, puzzled. Weiss orchestrated a theft, not of documents, but of confidence, in process, in timekeeping, in perception itself. He used the predictability of clocks, of bells, of ceremony and routine as instruments. He inserted chaos into something no man thinks to doubt. He tapped his fingers in a slow cadence on the armrest. A man who commits murder must plan for the blood, but a man like Weiss, he only needed minutes. Minutes shaped to precision, masked in velvet, and placed like dominoes against one another. I shook my head. And you admire him? Holmes's expression darkened, not quite anger, but a recognition of a worthy adversary. I admire the architecture, Watson, not the architect. His crime was immoral, but his timing, impeccable. That I will admit. He rose, stretched, and reached for his violin. In the end, 'tis not the loudest villains who unsettle me most. It is the ones who measure their wickedness with a metronome. It was a dull grey morning when we left Berlin. The iron frame of the Hauptbahnhof swallowed in mist and soot. The windows of our compartment were filmed with condensation, blurring the passing silhouettes of telegraph poles and factory chimneys, as if the city itself wished to recede from memory. Holmes sat opposite me, collar turned up, his long fingers interlaced beneath his chin in that familiar posture of abstraction. But there was a stillness in him, an inwardness I had not seen since the close of the Milverton affair, a peculiar detachment not from the world, but from victory. I did not disturb him. Even the quiet rattle of the train seemed to avoid his notice. Berlin had left its mark, not through violence, but through the strange elegance of its deceit, and I, for one, was glad to see its platforms retreat behind steel and steam. Holmes shifted only once to draw from his coat pocket a small velvet pouch. He did not open it, merely rested it upon his knee, his gaze still fixed upon some private horizon, far beyond the Saxon fields unspooling beside us. And so we rode on, in silence, toward home. It was not until we passed the Elbe that I saw what he carried. Holmes had withdrawn the object from its pouch, a tiny brass cog, no wider than a shilling, the teeth smooth from age or friction. He turned it slowly between thumb and forefinger, watching the dull gleam catch the morning light. "You kept it," I said, more softly than I had intended. He did not look up. "It served its purpose, and perhaps it may serve another." I hesitated. "Do you ever regret involving Krueger?" Holmes's fingers paused mid-turn. For a moment, I thought he might say nothing at all. Then, with a faint sigh, he resumed the motion. "She was already involved," he said, "long before we arrived." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet understanding, as though he had weighed the matter carefully, found no innocence left to disturb, and chosen to leave the scale as it stood. She was not the architect, Holmes said, still studying the gear, but she knew the stage well enough to build a trapdoor. His voice bore no triumph, only a peculiar weariness. In every city, he continued, there are those who bend the truth like a wire, slowly, imperceptibly, until it fits the shape they need. Most men live forward through time. A few simply learn how to wind the hands backward. He set the cog down gently upon the seat beside him. The danger is not that truth can be buried, Watson. The danger is that it can be rehearsed, repeated, until even those who watched it twist begin to doubt their own eyes. I said nothing. The rhythmic clatter of the train seemed suddenly too loud. Holmes did not look at me, but I thought I saw something tighten at the corner of his mouth. Not grief exactly, something more clinical, as if he had diagnosed the century itself. It was nearly noon when Holmes stirred again. He leaned back with a long exhale and gave me the faintest smile, that rare expression which surfaced only when the danger was past and the puzzle no longer resisted. "Berlin," he said at last, "keeps worse coffee and better secrets than London." I let out a short laugh in spite of myself. The tension broke like frost from glass. For a moment, we were not detectives or witnesses or reluctant conspirators, but merely two travellers sharing the quiet absurdities of a world too clever by half. Weeks later, I passed through Baker Street on a drizzling Tuesday and found Holmes at the mantel, wrapping a small parcel in brown paper. He made no effort to conceal it. On the desk lay a handwritten label, no address, no name, only a blank square. He sealed it, tied the string, and without a word, slipped it beneath his arm. "Post, Holmes?" I asked. He nodded once and stepped into the fog. To this day, I do not know who received the gear, nor why he sent it, but Holmes always returned balance to the clock. As the train carried us westward through the greying light of early evening, Holmes sat beside me in rare stillness, the brass gear turning slowly between his fingers. After a prolonged silence, he murmured almost to himself, "Time, Watson, is the subtlest of accomplices. It neither lies nor speaks, yet in the right hands, it conceals as deftly as any criminal." He looked up then, offering me a faint, knowing smile. It was not the stolen document that mattered most. It was the minute in which it vanished. What do you think? Was the true crime the act of espionage, or the manipulation of time itself? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this case from Baker Street, do subscribe for more mysteries and share it with a fellow Holmes enthusiast who loves a good puzzle buried in plain sight.